Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Humaira Badja. She's a rheumatologist, and today's Kevin MD article is titled A Doctor's Grief. Humaira, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
So, I want to start by just briefly sharing your story and journey to where you are today.
So I'm a rheumatologist and I have a long journey. I started off in India training and then moved to the States in the early 90s, trained in Connecticut and then in UCLA in rheumatology, worked in Boston for some time, and then I actually moved to Dubai several years ago where I've been practicing as a rheumatologist. I mainly moved to be closer to my aging parents in India and to take care of them because as they grew older. So my kids grew up here and they're back in the States now, but I'm still here in Dubai.
All right. So, what's it like to practice rheumatology in Dubai, having trained in the United States?
Well, initially it was very different. When I first arrived here, there were very few rheumatologists, but now it's very westernized, mostly Western trained rheumatologists from the UK and the US. And it's great. We have a great community. We attend conferences around the world. It's been a very exciting and interesting experience, actually, to work in a different culture, to learn from them.
And from a medical standpoint, what are some of the contrasts and differences between practicing in Dubai versus the States?
Well, there are two tracks here. We have a government system, which is free for nationals who belong to the country. And then we have a private practice system, which is very much like the United States. You have insurance payers, you have all the usual hassles of documentation, CPT codes, DRGs, burnout, and everything else, which we get in the United States. So it's very similar, actually, in a lot of ways.
And if a patient wanted to see you, a rheumatologist, a medical specialist, is there normally long wait times like elsewhere in the world, or can they see you relatively quickly?
Relatively quickly, actually. We're pretty well staffed here. There are lots of doctors, lots of access to care. There's mandatory health insurance for everyone because the majority of the population in Dubai is expatriate. So mostly people come from everywhere in the world and they have to have health insurance. So it's pretty easy. The many doctors here with various specialities, well trained. Healthcare system is quite good.
All right. So let's talk about your Kevin MD article. It's titled A Doctor's Grief. Now, tell me how this story and article came together.
So it happened a year ago when I was with my mother in the intensive care unit and observing what was going on. It was her so slow progress to death over a week. She fell, she broke her arm, and she was 90 years old, but otherwise feisty, very interested in everything around her. Talked to me every day for half an hour on the phone, telling me her stories, interested in politics, dashing off angry letters to the newspaper. So she luckily had her mental faculties very alert and a very alive person, but she fell and broke her arm, and that sort of just robbed her of everything one by one. Her organs started shutting down and she passed away. And the thing which, when you're someone very close to you is in the intensive care and you're just standing around there observing. I was with her the whole time. They allowed me to stay with her in the ICU. What you observe is not what we see as doctors. What we observe is just chaos, noise, people running around. There's a code blue in the next room. There's shouting. There's monitors beeping. It's noisy, um, and it's not peaceful at all. So I saw the struggle at the end of life, which wasn't very pleasant. I think not slipping away into the night as we would all like to. And we don't see that when we are the physicians. We're trying to save lives. We're trying to put that IV in. We're trying to get that central line in. We're trying to do that CPR. We're giving shocks. We're just trying to get people back. And sometimes I think, we're not letting people go peacefully. That was something I observed. And the second part of this was the grief which came. And, after the funeral, and I came back to work, and, people were giving me the condolences, my longtime patients. And, you just hold it in as a doctor. We don't express our emotions at work. We are supposed to be stoic, and we're taught that from a very early stage in our careers, not to express emotion, to be to gracefully accept death, to gracefully accept life, whatever we do. So the There was this one patient who had many losses herself. She lost a few children, and she just came in and she saw, I think, it in my face. Maybe she recognized grief, and she held me, and I wept. And that was a very unusual experience for me, to just weep in a patient's arms. And, that was a few weeks or so after I'd come back from the funeral. And that made me think about how we process grief as doctors, and write that article. And that's where that came from, because we don't really, I mean, we do tear up sometimes over patient stories, but we don't really fall into a patient's arms and weep.
Now, you said earlier that doctors stereotypically are trained to be stoic and not show emotion. Talk about some of the pressures that you face during training that reinforces those stereotypes that pressured you not to show emotion.
Yes. So as residents, we know that we face death for the first time as interns. We call in to, to declare a person dead. And we come in and we try to be professional, and we break the news to the family. And, I remember as an intern, there were so many difficult moments when you talk to patients, you break the bad news. I had to once tell a family that their only son had terminal, incurable bone cancer. And this was during training as a fellow in rheumatology. And we break bad news. It's heartbreaking sometimes, and we do tear up. But I think it's most impactful during training, because that's when we're first encountering it. And as an older doctor now, I feel you get more maybe inured to it. You get more resistant to so much of emotion. You learn to hold it in. And I think we're not really processing our grief, and we haven't been trained. I think there are now programs set in place to help residents process grief at patients passing away, at telling bad news, and how we share that loss with the patient's family or share that sadness. But when we trained, we did not have that sort of, support. We had to hold it in. We, would talk to each other maybe, or cry a bit, and have to get on with it. And we're just so busy that the next day, the next death, and the next, and then there's people we save, and that always, changes things, and that's how we balanced it out. But I do think that's not enough. We now have statistics showing that 30% of residents suffer from depression. Doctors have a higher rate of suicide than the general population, because maybe we hold so much of it in, not showing our emotions, not processing grief better.
Now, after your mother passed away and you didn't feel that you could express that emotion and process your grief, how difficult was that period for you to do that?
Yeah, it was very difficult trying to be very stoic, and because many of my patients would know that I'd gone away for a funeral. And it was difficult when they gave me their condolences, not to think about my loss. And I have friends who have lost a child and had to go back to work, because of course this is our calling to our profession. And those are more difficult losses, but they also had to be in the situation. So it was very difficult. And actually, after my article, I found that so many people reached out to me from around the world.
Wow.
They wrote to me. There was a woman who is working in another country, not the United States. So your article, of course, reaches everyone everywhere in the world, your articles. So she reached out to me that she lost her mother. She's a doctor. She doesn't feel like going back to work. She was so close to her mother, and she just felt so depressed. And she chatted with me for a while. And people from the United States wrote to me and reached out to me. So obviously, it struck a chord that many of us do this, where we go back to work, we just try to get on with it, and we don't process things enough. We don't get help, maybe. We don't have time for grief counseling. So maybe all of these things could help us, and we need to learn self care better.
How difficult was it for you to concentrate on work after you had to go back?
I think actually for me, work saves me, because when I'm there, I really focus. And then, you're focusing on other people's problems, their own problem, sickness. And their stories. And I think that helps me a lot. It's actually my therapy going back to work. It is sort of wrong to say, but when I'm at work, I feel better.
Now, in your ideal world, how would you envision doctors to process their grief? What would you like to see?
I really think that, psychiatrists go regularly to get counseled. They have to, unburden themselves. But in this time when we are going through a lot, doctors are going through so much burnout, finding things so difficult. I belong to various doctors groups where people are talking about burnout. They just can't work anymore. They've lost the joy in their profession. I think all of us need to either go to group sessions or therapy. And we did organize this during COVID with psychologists and psychiatrists, where we talked about how we would handle the pressures during COVID. And we came out through a very difficult time then when there was a lot of burden and pressures on people and our families too, because we could be bringing infection to them. And so I think we do need help. We are not superheroes. We need to be in regular sessions with people. We need support groups.
Mhm.
We have a very good female support group here where we get together regularly, which is not CME, but just support to talk, doctors who talk to each other. And I think that helps. But having friends helps. But I think we do need professional support structures, especially in hospitals where there's a lot of burnout, people in emergency room and in ICU settings. We do need that sort of help.
Now, you mentioned earlier that when your article was published on Kevin MD, you received some emails and similar stories from physicians around the world. Now, what kind of advice did you give them? How did you counsel them through their periods of grief?
I actually told them to, some of them were very depressed, and I told them to seek help. I said, you need, and they were afraid. So, this is the problem with our profession. They were afraid to seek help because they don't want to seem to be a damaged physician. If we take medication for depression, we might seem damaged. So, they actually said that they didn't want to see anyone and they didn't want anyone in their professional circles to know about their problems. And this is something we also need to get past, that medical boards should not look at us as someone who we're trying to help ourselves and be better people and seek help, and we should not be, in some way being punished for this.
Now, what are some of the things that we could do to normalize that behavior of seeking help? How can we break that stigma of physicians seeking behavioral health treatment?
I really think we need to speak up for this. We are human. There's been a long, I think, tradition of silence about ourselves as human beings. I don't know if this is similar in your training, but we were not encouraged really to share our personal stories with patients or to talk about ourselves or to, say, yes, that was my experience too. And sometimes that helps. Talking to patients and saying, patients sometimes talk to me about their kids. They start struggling with their teenagers or they're struggling with something else in their marriage. And, we're not supposed to tell them, yes, that happened to my son too, or that happened to my kid too. So we're not seen as human. And I think we need to start regarding first ourselves as human, and the culture around us needs to change. We are not superhumans. I think we need to be able to share our stories as well. We need to be more personal with our patients, get closer to them, and this whole culture and the way we train our residents needs to change.
Now, after going through this experience and processing your grief, how has that changed you as a physician as you saw patients going forward?
I think this was the big loss in my life. And I think that I understand their losses much better now. So many people have talked to me about losing a parent or losing a child. And I really feel I can relate much better. It makes me a better person because I relate better. It makes me closer to them and more empathetic. Shall we say I was empathetic before, but it was something which you don't understand. You don't have a close understanding or experience of. So when we experience something, just like we doctors have not experienced illness, and when we experience illness, we are on the other side and we are sort of different as patients. So experiencing loss, I don't want anyone to experience loss, but it's going to come to all of us at some point, makes us understand other people's losses better. And I think being human being regarded as human with our patients, it's very, very important.
We're talking to Humaira Badshah. She's a rheumatologist. Today's Kevin MD article titled A Doctor's Grief. Humaira, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
I really feel physicians, we need to take time for ourselves. I mean, it sounds really like a cliche, but travel, read, be interested in the arts, in music, in books, or whatever rocks your boat. Take time for that, because if not, we are at the edge of burnout. All of us are at the edge of burnout or already there. We need to have that passion back in what we do. I do still have the passion back because I think I love those patient stories. I love every single one of my patient stories. And everyone says, how can you be a rheumatologist for so long? And I say it's because every story is different. Every patient comes with a different set of problems and a different story, and you need to know the stories behind the patient. They're not just rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or diabetes type 2. They each have their story, and we need to get to know those stories because that makes them interesting to us as a human being, and we to them. Share a little bit of yourself with your patient to make you interesting to your patient.
Well, thank you again for sharing your story, time, and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you.